Today, we're going to start with the important question that all of you should be able to answer. Why save seeds? Why are we all here? There are a lot of reasons why we should save seeds. We're going to mention just a few here. First reason we have listed here is what we refer to as bioregional adaptation. So what we mean by bioregional adaptation are essentially seeds that know their place, seeds that have been cultivated and co-evolved with humans in situ. When seeds are grown, a plant is grown from seed to seed in place. It learns, it remembers, it co-evolves, and it starts to understand local climates, pests, diseases, et cetera, et cetera. Unfortunately, due to decades of consolidation in the seed industry, we've lost a lot of regionalized varieties in favor of essentially one-size-fits-all methodologies that try to breed one or two varieties over a wide swath of adaptable adaptable conditions. Because if you're a seed company, it's a lot easier to manage one variety of carrot that does reasonably well over a lot of conditions than a carrot for every region. So we're returning to bioregional adaptation because we feel this is the most important way that we can address the changing climate, and that we can grow seeds and plants and food in a holistic way without the need for excessive inputs, because we are adapting seeds to the conditions that we're growing. Another reason is the preservation of historical varieties. We are fortunate in Westport to have the Macomber turnip, which is a poster child for this very variety, and which I would be remiss to not mention at least 3 times during this presentation and ones going forward. Historical varieties carry with them stories of who we are and where we've been. They're varieties that have been generally kept in a particular area and have tremendous potential in terms of things that have not been bred out of them to use, and also just for community connection and building. Which brings us to cultural significance. Cultural significance would be anything from particular varieties that are bred or have been grown for ways that they're prepared for food cuisines, all the way to literal ancestral embodiments that seeds are for particular cultures. So seeds and humans are inextricably intertwined. And we're not just looking at why to save seeds for climate adaptation, why to save seeds for political reasons. Seeds are stories of us, again, where we've been, who we are, and they carry great significance depending on people's particular culture, and are adapted to not just where they've been grown, but in particular preparations that have cultural significance for people's foodways. Encourage genetic diversity. One of the first and most startling findings when I delved into seed years and years ago was the statistic that blindsided me as I was holding up seeds in my hand, that an estimated 93% of our genetic diversity in our food has been lost in the last century, which means essentially everything that we're reckoning with now comprises about 7% of what we had 100 years ago. So just let that sit in for a moment and think about where we're at now. The more genetic diversity we have intravarietally and within the different food crops that we're eating, the better we're able to continue to feed ourselves in the changing world. Also, it's mentioned a lot of times that a reason to save seeds is for self-reliance. And that's true enough. The more that you can do yourself or within your family, the less you have to depend on outside sources. But we also look at seed saving as a community reliance. It's not just an autonomous individual or nuclear family that benefits from seed saving. It's an entire community that's able to come together and exchange seeds and cut out the supply chain and grow things and cultivate things and co-adapt to things that are preferable to their particular region and their culture. So there's an autonomy sense there, autonomy from monopoly, meaning the consolidation of seed companies that we will get into in a little bit. But just to touch on that now, essentially, we're in a position where you will see in just a few slides where 4 multinational companies control a majority of the world's seed through various means of intellectual property. So the autonomy we're talking about is not just a simple individual self-reliance. It's an autonomy from the consolidation of seeds, which gives us more control over what we grow and how we grow it. We would be overlooking a very important component of why we're saving seeds if we didn't turn to beauty. Seeds are beautiful, plants are beautiful, and when you save a plant that you've grown in your garden and grow that seed the following year, you form a relationship and a pact with that plant, which is really extraordinary. There is beauty laden in every element of that. But the intimacy with which one comes to understand, particularly in this case, garden varieties of vegetables that we're growing, when you've saved seed from place to place, is really remarkable. And then lastly, on our list, something that we all need more of these days, hope. Saving seed is a promise. We envision saving seed also as a way of repaying the debt that we've borrowed from the generations to come. It cultivates hope because you can't save seed and not believe that there's a future. By saving that seed, you are cultivating a future, a viable future where people can feed themselves and have control over what and how they eat. So those are just a few of the many reasons why we think it's important to save seeds. And I hope at least one of those is resonating with you and is why you're here. So we're going to spend a little bit just kind of coming back around to the political point of what intellectual property is relative to seeds. Just to give sort of a brushstroke understanding of where we've been and where we are now. Intellectual property in seed was not an overnight nefarious scheme by one or several large entities. It was an evolving process and an incremental process. And I would also note a process that started to ensure that breeders were protected for the decade or longer of work that they put into cultivating new varieties. So on the top there, you see the first two, plant patents and plant variety protection. These both essentially were intellectual property restrictions that applied for the breeder to insulate themselves from another seed company or another breeder appropriating their material and using it as they saw fit, so that they could be compensated for the work that they did. How these are used is not really relative to the kinds of political conversations we may be delving in this class. Some of the things below are what we're going to focus a little more on here. So there are trademarks, but trademarks refer much more to sort of the branding of a particular fruit or vegetable rather than something that is restricted for those who grow it. So the Vidalia onion is a great example. Pink Lady apple, as we have here. That's more trademarking a name that when you go to the store, you know that there's a Pink Lady apple there. It's not exactly an intellectual property on the seed itself. Bag tags are something that some may be familiar with from the software movements. Historical software whereby you open up a package and there's a little sticker or a sign on that that says, by opening this bag, you agree to the following terms and conditions. A lot of times the bag tags within seed are bag tags that restrict individual ability to share, to sell, to trade, to breed with seed. But most of the time, that bag tag is not passed on to the consumer when you look inside a seed catalog. In fact, it's very rare. So bag tags can apply on things like heirloom vegetables that we generally feel are just within the public domain. If some company or seed house has that in their collection and they are the ones that are growing the seed and releasing it to other seed companies, they can release it with the bag tag caveat that they are the exclusive purveyors of this seed and they control where it goes and how it's used. So even though we have heirlooms and what we'll talk in a little bit about open pollinated varieties that generally are in the public domain, bag tags are a way of seed companies controlling even varieties that are otherwise under the public domain. Next on here, we have utility patents. And generally when we're talking about the most egregious and problematic versions of intellectual property, we're talking about a utility patent. So we'll spare the history for now, but suffice to say that a series of court cases eventually allowed life to be patentable from 1980 onward. That's what you see there, Diamond v. Chakrabarty. That was a court case that in a 5-4 ruling, a genetically engineered bacterium that could clean up oil spills was allowed to be patented. This was the first time that life had been patented and opens the floodgates for other forms of life to be patented that historically were considered off limits for utility patents. So what exactly is a utility patent? Utility patent is something that if you create novel art or something new into the world, you go to the U.S. Patent and Trade Office and you file for a utility patent. And there are criteria for this utility patent that have to be met. The two with regard to plants, plant germplasm, and plant breeding processes that are most problematic are that there's a requirement that no prior art has existed. So if something similar to this prior art has existed in the world, then there's not a case for novelty, and therefore it cannot be eligible for your utility patent. The other one is what's called in the trade non-obviousness. So basically, things that may come out as a consequence of the breeding process that were not anticipated. These are new things that were not something that a breeder could look at and say, "Oh yeah, if you cross these two, you'll get this," and it would be evident that that would be a line of causality from the breeding. Instead, this is something that was not obvious before, so therefore it is able to be claimed under a utility patent qualification. The problem with this is the line has been blurred from something like a genetically engineered strawberry where the genes of a fish have been injected in, and you've crossed kingdoms. There's a case to be made that that's something new because we have not seen that in the natural world. Where this becomes especially problematic is that utility patents now are not just on genetically engineered varieties where the previous claim can be made. They're on what's called classically bred varieties, meaning two parents make a kid, that kid can be patentable. The traits of that kid can be patentable. The process by which that kid was bred can be patentable. And then all the progeny derived from that patented variety can also be patentable for the duration of the patent. This is like saying that the parent lines that produced this kid were not prior art, and the traits that the kid inherited just magically recombined out of nowhere and weren't derived from its genetics, which we feel to be deeply concerning. But the precedent has been set, and this is happening with increasing regularity because once the precedent has been set, it's very easy to reference that precedent when you are applying for a new utility patent. So we're seeing utility patents on things like the particular colors of lettuce, the redness of lettuce, sweetness of melons, a particular floral back of the palate sweetness of a melon. These are all things that are also patented in addition to the varieties themselves. So that means by implication, those things are extracted out of the commons. So if an independent breeder is to stumble upon this same red on the electromagnetic spectrum of this lettuce, they can be potentially sued because they violated a utility patent. Lastly, what we'll get into in just a moment here is an F1 hybrid. We're going to unpack what hybrids actually mean and what an F1 hybrid is. But right now, we're looking at this in terms of intellectual property to say that by creating an F1 hybrid, the breeder or the company that's breeding this hybrid are the only ones who know and have access to the parent lines that create that hybrid, which is a de facto way of proprietary ownership where they don't have to purchase an expensive utility patent or apply for an expensive plant variety protection. They can actually just know what nobody else can. And because, as we'll find out, most cases, F1 hybrids do not grow true to type, there's not a concern of people saving seed and doing something else with it. So it's sort of like a hidden way to have IPR as a result of the breeding process. This is just to lend gravity to what we're discussing here with regard to the consolidation. You can look at this on Phil Howard's website, which I believe is on the bottom, philhoward.net. He has made a number of really fantastic and vivid diagrams like this that map consolidation within various industries. I think he did one for the food agribusiness industry. He did one for the beer industry and a few others. But this just drives home. You see four big bubbles here: Bayer, BASF, ChemChina, and Corteva. These four companies collectively control about 3/4 of the world's seed through various intellectual property means that we just discussed. They all happen to also be chemical companies that favor vertical integration. So the idea is if you control the entire chain, you control the food. Everybody's got to eat. So it's a brilliant business strategy if you're an economist. So let's move on to what is a hybridized plant. Generally, when we're talking about hybrids in the context of our own seed saving going forward, we'll be referring to what here is known as an F1 hybrid. So after this slide, going forward, unless otherwise specified, when I'm saying hybrid, we're using hybrid interchangeably with F1 hybrid. So generally speaking, hybridization happens all the time in nature. Even when you're saving open pollinated varieties, if there's enough requisite diversity in that open pollinated variety, it's hybridizing every time it crosses and recrosses with itself, even if it's stable. So hybridization is always happening in nature. It is the way that things evolve. And what a hybridized plant is simply a result of crossing two genetically distinct parents. even if those parents are somewhat similar to one another in terms of what we call a variety. Because when we're talking about a variety, it's important to remember we're not talking about clones. We're not talking about genetically uniform population. We're talking about a somewhat diverse population that has enough recognizable traits that we can say that's a Cherokee purple tomato, or that's Ventura celery, or something like that. So a variety still has enough diversity in it to, hopefully, to cross and recross and rehybridize with itself, on and on and on and on. We want that kind of hybridization. So that being said, hybrids in this context going forward will be specifically F1 hybrids. The way that F1 hybrids are made is that parent lines are carefully cultivated until they embody the exact traits that the breeder wants to make a cross and have a predictable outcome, a predictable offspring year after year after year. So the problem with this is that all the effort is not into the varietal maintenance, it's into the maintenance of the parent lines. And every time they cross and they make the kid, this kid is what's sold. If you save seed from that F1, the second generation, the F2 generation, is a kaleidoscope of traits that were not expressed in the first generation. This is a good opportunity for curious gardeners or for breeders to have genetic diversity that's not expressing itself, because it can often vary wildly from what the parents are. It can also be a 10-year project to stabilize something that you love and want to continue on that's actually now a hybrid, but eventually can work its way with careful cultivation to become an open pollinated variety. But for most people, the fact that there is such a variation in the second generation discourages people from saving seed. What we have here is just a little reference below to what we already discussed, which is that parent lines most often are inbred. So they're inbred to the point where if you want to make this carrot, let's say, you have one parent that has the color and the shape that you want, and the other one that has the disease resistance. And they are bred just for color and shape, just for disease resistance. And every time they cross, that combination is what you want, and that becomes the F1. The intellectual property behind this, again, is these parent lines. Nobody knows who these parent lines are except for the breeder or the individual. And therefore, most people cannot recreate this at home if they wanted to make their own hybrid, because as we'll see a little later on, F1 hybrids can be a very useful tool, a sort of shortcut to get to the exact traits that you want. But as fellow seeds person and plant breeder Frank Morton says, the breakdown in the hybridization process is not the exception to the rule, it's in fact the rule itself. Meaning, if hybrids are designed to do one or two things really well, to be really uniform, all at the same time, so you can run your undercutter bar and harvest all those carrots with a crew at once, instead of going out and picking a few here and picking a few there. Once that the world around us evolves, pathogens evolves, conditions change, the breakdown of how resilient that variety can be is more the norm than an exception to the rule. It's not that this hybrid just happened to collapse because there wasn't enough diversity there. Hybrids are good at doing one or several things really well, and when conditions change, they're often not good at doing it from that point on. So here we have a slide that is basically putting F1 hybrids, which going forth will just be known as hybrids, with open pollinated or OPs. So an open pollinated variety basically describes a plant variety that with the right conditions and isolation techniques, you can reliably save seed from. So all heirlooms are open pollinated varieties, but not all OPs are heirlooms. Reason being, heirloom is a cultural definition. It's not a botanical definition. And generally an heirloom is agreed upon, depending on who you ask, a plant variety that's been within a family or a culture for 50 years or more. 50 years ago, people weren't making hybrids like they are now. So if it's an heirloom, it's safe enough to say that it's an open pollinated variety. Generally speaking, there can be more inherent potential within an open pollinated variety for genetic diversity. It's not universally true in the sense that an heirloom can either be widely variable, which is exciting in terms of, selecting or using it in breeding, but also some heirlooms have just been saved by one person in their postage stamp garden from one or two plants for generations, which means there's much more of a tendency towards a genetic bottleneck with that heirloom. And in fact, a lot of heirlooms, especially tomatoes, is a glaring example, need sort of a re-imbuing of genetic diversity to stay resilient and robust going forward. So generally, there's more potential inherent genetic diversity, but not always. And then On the other side of things, with an F1 hybrid, generally there is less potential genetic diversity if the parent lines are really inbred, because you'll have this kaleidoscope that comes in the F2 generation with recrossing, but you can only go so far with it. So sometimes it can be a dead end, but it can also be an opportunity to have many parent or new parent lines coming out of the second or third generation that can be diverse enough to select and breed with. So there are always exceptions to every rule. That is the only rule in nature, is that there are exceptions to the rule. So what we're going to be talking about going forward in this course are annuals and biennials. We will not really delve into perennials on any of these slides, although we may make reference to them, say, chives or garlic chives when we're talking about Alia or something like that. Mostly we're going to be talking about annuals and biennials. So just so that we're on the same page with everyone, an annual is a plant that is grown from seed. It germinates, it flowers, it seeds, and it goes into senescence, or it dies, all in one season. There are annuals that may not perpetuate or continue its entire life cycle in one season if it's too far north or something like that. There are also perennials that we treat as annuals that further south could be perennialized. But generally speaking, we're talking about northeast growing, things that we consider annuals. Biennials, for example, a lot of our root vegetables, carrots, beets, turnips, and so forth. These are plants whose life cycle spans 2 growing seasons. So you spend one season, let's say one fall, growing the root material. This will be all the energy that's stored that goes dormant to wake up and flower and go to seed in the next season. So this is not just in reference to root vegetables. It's also things like the brassica family, kale and collards and so forth, that don't have a bulbous root, but all that energy is in its actual roots and its stalk, and sometimes in the growing tip on the top as well. So this is just a definition to say, if we're talking about a biennial, that means if you're interested in growing seed in it, you're making a commitment to grow this over 2 seasons. And there are some things that in our climate, or especially further south, you could leave outside and not make the commitment of digging things up. But other times we're going to share certain techniques that we use in the Northeast to make sure that our biennials are safely producing seed in the following year. Underneath biennials, you see there is a word called vernalization. And so vernalization is basically a requisite period of cold dormancy. All biennials need to go through a period of cold and then wake up from that period of cold to transition their energy into flowering and seed producing energy. So if you have a beet and you grow that beet in the fall and you leave that beet at 40 degrees for the rest of its life cycle, it doesn't matter how many months you keep that beet is not going to make a flower. It might put some shoots out, but as long as it's in a cold temperature, somewhat indefinitely, that beet is never going to go to flower. So different plants and different varieties within particular plant families and species have different requirements. But generally speaking, a sort of universal vernalization period is what we listed here, which is 40 degrees at 8 to 10 weeks. With almost anything that you're growing, that's generally a safe regimen to say, this biennial will wake up after this period and will be ready to start flowering and produce seed. We're going to talk, when we describe particular crop families, about self-pollination and cross-pollination. Selfers or outcrossers, essentially. Unfortunately, there is a tendency to treat these as a binary, that something is either self-pollinating or cross-pollinating. Binaries don't exist in the plant world. Generally speaking, one end of the continuum, self-pollination, is something that is capable of pollinating itself. You have one pepper plant, it can produce viable seed from one pepper plant. You have one tomato plant, it can produce seed from one tomato plant. As you'll find when we get to those, it's generally not recommended to save seed just from one plant. But on the extreme end, self-pollination is something that can grow true to type and generally not suffer too much worse for the wear by having smaller populations. On the other end of the spectrum is cross-pollination. And the extreme example of this are things that we refer to sometimes as obligate outcrossers. So things that actually can't even receive pollen, its own pollen, even if it has a flower structure that has pollen on it. It requires other plants to be pollinated. And a lot of things that are outcrossers that even can receive their own pollen, if the timing and the mechanisms sync up right, will very quickly regress into what is known as inbreeding depression. A good example of this is corn, which is wind pollinated. Corn needs a large population to remain vigorous and resilient. That's not to discourage you if you have a small garden, as you'll find when we're talking about corn. There are strategies. Everybody, it's all hands on deck. If you have a small garden or a 70 or 100-acre farm, everybody is needed in this effort. But generally speaking, with a large population, if you were growing, let's say, 1 or 2 or 3 corn plants in your garden, and you saved 1 ear from one of those plants, every single year, in about 5 years, you'd have a really sick, sad-looking corn. That corn very quickly will revert to inbreeding depression because it needs friends. It needs a large opportunity to receive pollen in order to stay robust and diverse. So on this continuum are all sorts of plants that one may see in seed manuals as listed self-pollinator, but they are promiscuous. A great example of this early on was an endeavor for us to take out 125 accessions from the USDA gene bank of fava beans, thinking this will be great. We'll grow all these fava beans side by side, and we'll screen them for the diseases that are prevalent in the Northeast, and we'll just save seed from the best ones that live. Because favas are in the bean family, and beans are almost always self-pollinating. In fact, a lot of beans, depending on the species, are extremely self-pollinating and may not even receive pollen from 20 feet away unless there's a very diligent bumblebee, which in gardens with biological diversity, we could pretty much count on. So favas are a great example because if you have one fava plant, you save seeds from the one fava plant, you'll have viable seed. And you can probably continue that on for a while and still have a pretty good fava. If you have 3 different species of favas growing side by side by side, next year you'll almost certainly have a brand new type of favas or several brand new types of favas because favas' flower structure, even though it's self-pollinating, is such that it will cross rampantly with its neighbors. Eggplant's another good example of that. So let's just understand this when we're talking about our crops going forward, the plants that we're working with, as a continuum. And I will be as diligent as my memory allows me to insist when something is self-pollinating, but particularly promiscuous or rampant, and vice versa. When something is an outcrosser that's also capable of potentially saving seed from one plant, if it's an emergency situation, if it's the last plant on Earth and you can't do anything else with it. Some more definitions. These are a little more clear-cut. Generally, we're going to speak about wet-seeded and dry-seeded. Dry-seeded are things that the pods grow in the plants. They almost always turn tan or brown, and they're dry and crackly, and you crack them open, and there are your seeds. Wet-seeded, tomato being a great example. Others of these could be melons, cucumbers. Wet-seeded crops are crops generally that have that live inside of a fruit that has a high moisture content. And so they need to be insulated from not just sprouting inside the moisture of that tomato, because you can imagine what it would look like if we cracked open a tomato and those seeds weren't able to resist the moisture that's inside that tomato. You'd have a bunch of sprouted seeds inside your tomato. So in the case of a tomato and most other wet-seeded crops, there is a gelatinous sac that forms around the seed itself that needs to be or benefits greatly from being broken down when you're saving seed. There are cases to be made that you resist a lot more diseases by the fermentation process with wet-seeded crops that we'll talk about once we get to them. But there is a very simple and straightforward way of processing wet-seeded crops. So this is just both for your own terminology going forward and also to think what resonates with you. What are you excited about saving seed, and what are the ways that you can set yourself up for success so that you're not having to bring something into your kitchen last minute that you didn't anticipate, or you don't have somewhere, cool and dry to store your seeds and so forth. So you'll see us talk very frequently about wet seed and dry seeded crops. Lastly here, processing and storing seeds. The 2 general components to cleaning seed are threshing and winnowing. So threshing is, as we have here, extracting the seed from the hull or pod. Whatever container that seed is in, you are breaking that container open to have the viable seed underneath. Once you've broken that, you're going to have most likely quite a mess ahead of you. And so winnowing is the process of cleaning the seed from whatever debris comes out of that. Maybe it's pieces of pods, maybe it's stems, desiccated leaves, the chaff around the seed itself or the hull of the seed. So the winnowing is actually the cleaning of the seed after it's been extracted from its hull or pod or processed in the case of wet seeding if there's other debris around. There are very simple ways to winnow, and then there are also some more high-tech ways, and we'll cover those on a crop-by-crop basis as we're discussing them. So once you've cleaned your seeds, the general storage guidelines for seeds, we follow this magic algorithm that says the temperature plus relative humidity should not exceed 100. Basically, if the temperature is 60 degrees, you want the relative humidity to be 40 or less. And if the temperature is 40 degrees, you want the temperature to be 58 or so, you want the relative humidity to be 58 or so. That is the best means of ensuring that seeds are sufficiently dry to store, because there's nothing worse than thinking your seeds are dry and putting them in a jar and tucking them away, and then taking that lid off next season and smelling the mold emitting and having seeds that are not viable. A very quick way to test for dryness before you put them in is if the seed snaps or shatters. So in the case of something larger like a bean or a corn seed, you can take actually a little hammer or something to bang the seed. And if the seed immediately splinters apart into multiple pieces, you know it's dry enough to store. If the seed takes a dent or kind of chunks off in a way that it's bending, it's almost certainly not dry enough. On a smaller scale, if you can take a pepper seed or a cucumber seed and snap it between your fingers, then you know it's dry enough to store. There are some other more sophisticated techniques that we'll include in slides later on, including cobalt chloride humidity strips that are now available, pretty easy to find, widespread. So there are other ways of testing that are a little more precise, but this is the general way that you've gotten your seeds this far, you've grown the seeds, you've threshed and winnowed the seeds. To lose them in the 11th hour is really heartbreaking, and I think discourages a lot of people feeling like it's too complicated, and it's not too complicated. It's really just a matter of knowing when they go in, having the confidence that they are dry enough to store. So lastly here, these are just a handful of books. Every year we either bring these in or we get asked about what kind of references for people to go a little deeper. I'll leave this up right now just so people can familiarize themselves with these. We'll also make them available on the website. Different books address different needs. The Organic Seed Grower by my late great friend and mentor, Dr. John Navazio, is more focused on farm scale, how to grow seed on a larger scale, but there's plenty of important information and anecdotes for growers of any scale. The Seed Garden is a recent publication by Seed Savers Exchange that has a really nice articulation of things that we'll cover in this class largely. Is something self-pollinated? What is it cross-compatible with? What's proper storage and so forth? Being a student of the late, great Dr. Navazio, we find that most seed manuals have a minimum population, especially for outcrossers, that we feel is somewhat inadequate. So you'll hear, if you're following along with the Seed Garden or some of the other books, Seed to Seed here, that we're advocating for larger populations than what are listed in these seed-saving manuals. That's not to discourage you, because again, there are all sorts of strategies that we'll get into in the coming weeks about how to save seeds, even on a small garden. Essentially get to know your neighbors well. But the reason that we're doing that is because Dr. Navazio was really extraordinary in his work with open pollinated varieties and growing varieties that, as he put it, had a good constitution, meaning they were genetically robust enough that they could continue on and co-evolve for generations to come. But that was based upon a lot of work with population sizes, which he found the seed-saving manuals generally were not sufficient over varietal maintenance over the long term. So it's one thing if you have a very precious or rare seed and you just want to figure out how to save seed from that variety and multiply it and get it back into the world. It's another thing if you want to create a new breeding project and have a new fabulous tomato in the world or whatever is calling to your heart. But varietal maintenance is specifically setting up your seed-saving endeavors for the long term. So that's the idea of what does the population have to be that there's sufficient genetic robustness and diversity that it can continue to carry on and co-evolve without basically slamming into a wall with the mutation of a new pathogen or the change of a climate. So you'll see a disparity there if you are following along with any of these. We usually err on the larger side, but there has been research showing that some of these smaller populations also work on a crop-by-crop basis. So you be the judge. Try it out and follow along. Please feel free to email questions and hope to see you over the coming weeks as we unpack the nitty-gritty of saving seeds from everything that we know and love.